Hello, everyone. Welcome to Palladium Magazine's Digital Salon with Vitalik Buterin. I'm Wolf Tivey, Editor-in-Chief of Palladium. I'm joined, as usual, by Ash Milton, Managing Editor.
Hey,
Hi,
everyone.
Ash. Our guest today is Vitalik Buterin. Vitalik co-founded Bitcoin Magazine and the Ethereum project. He's recently been expanding his attention into more general problems of political theory, governance, and society, which, of course, topics that we're very interested in here at Palladium. So we're looking forward to diving in. Welcome, Vitalik.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Thanks. So we're joined, as usual, by our live audience of Palladium members and friends. The conversation will be recorded, rebroadcast on YouTube, and as a podcast. To become a Palladium member and get invited to upcoming salons, please visit palladiummag.com/subscribe. The plan is for Ash, Vitalik, and I to have a discussion for about half an hour, 45 minutes, and then move on to questions from our live audience. Please be sure to use the Q&A feature in Zoom to post your question. So to get started, Vitalik, you're known for your Bitcoin and Ethereum work, but you've started to get more into political theory, mechanism design, similar issues nowadays. Mm-hmm. Overall, how would you describe your goals and overall project right now? Is it a theory? Is it a movement or something else?
It's definitely some of both. And I think the blockchain and cryptocurrency world has never kind of been that distant from, I think, the world of kind of thinking about interesting and radical political ideas. Like, right. People don't really even know this now, right? But if you look at the Bitcoin forums, what's currently bitcointalk.org, back in kind of the 2011 and 2012 days when I joined, and at the time it was a lot of libertarians, some socialists, some kind of people of other stripes, but there was just a lot of interesting discussion on, how could privatized police work? Could a free market deal with problems of discrimination? Like, what could private insurance companies do? And like all of these kind of theoretical kind of questions. And like, this was a major hobby of what was kind of back then the Bitcoin space, right? And so like, I had been interested in kind of those kinds of questions, and I'd kind of read a lot of kind of the libertarian stuff, a lot of the socialist stuff, even back when I was a teenager. And so I was very interested in kind of that debate, kind of the divide and the or the discourse at the time. And a lot of people were in the Bitcoin community as well. And since then, of course, Bitcoin has kind of expanded into cryptocurrency and blockchain, and you have Bitcoin and Bitcoin Cash and Ethereum and EOS and the Ethereum Classic and all of these sub-movements and private blockchains. And so like that spirit that was there and in the earlier days has definitely been kind of diluted in the community a bit, just because the community has gotten bigger. But I feel like within myself, it's always been there, right? And I've always viewed blockchains as not just a currency, but also as a way of kind of practically implementing and experimenting with kind of a lot of just different ways of organizing, whether it's kind of alternatives to like corporations, kind of, DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations, whether it's kind of auctions and market design. Like, these are all things that have always been a significant part of just what excited me about Ethereum, just the fact that we can create a platform where you can then just like go write code and actually implement and do the things. And so kind of while being interested in actually building and actually growing the platform, I've also been simultaneously interested in just understanding better, well, what are the properties of these things that we could build?
Yeah. So one of the big kind of underlying themes here in all these projects is, I've seen it as kind of trying to replace corruptible bureaucratic systems or corruptible centralized systems with sort of these more incorruptible protocols and mechanisms that they don't have central nodes. They can't be sort of seized by rent seekers or become centers of conflict. Is that sort of a fair description of one of the core threads of this whole movement?
I think so, definitely.
I mean, it seems like on the one hand, there's a very natural jump from engineering when it comes to Bitcoin or any of these other technologies to let's think about how these mechanisms can be socially thought about and integrated. But obviously, social engineering has a very negative connotation, especially among people with more libertarian sentiments, right? So I'm interested, was this an evolution you had to make in your thinking at all? Or if not, like, how have you communicated that to other people in your space?
No, and there's definitely a bit of a divide here within the kind of the cryptocurrency space, which is basically it's almost like are cryptocurrencies invented or discovered. And if you think about it, like if you just think about it from a kind of outsider point of view, I think it seems obvious that cryptocurrencies are invented because it's like a really complex piece of code. There's kind of hundreds of arbitrary choices that you can make. But at the same, like people more on the Bitcoin side, they definitely come closer to a position that feels more like saying cryptocurrencies are discovered, right? Like they think of like Bitcoin, for example, as being something that's kind of fairly close to the ideal type of money. And, you know, it's got zero inflation. It's got kind of these perfect properties. It's got this kind of immaculate conception. It was kind of created once in this way that can't be copied. And so like, this is the thing. And if you try to change the thing, well, you know, you can't do that. Whereas on the Ethereum side, there's definitely more of a, well, yes, these ultimately are social systems. And yes, we can kind of build them and change the rules. Now, does that constitute kind of social engineering, or like the other kind of negative buzzword that people use, central planning? So I actually wrote a post on this. This was the post that I wrote with Glenn about 1.5 years ago. It's central planning as overfitting.
And this is Glenn Weil from Radical Exchange, just to for our audience.
Yes, Glenn Weil from Radical Exchange. And so the idea there that I advance, right, is basically I advance the idea that kind of people believe things like central planning is bad or kind of small government is good, and like, you know, we want more kind of natural systems. And I try to create a kind of model within which these sentiments kind of have value and are very important, but in an often kind of different sense from the sense in which they kind of sometimes get advanced, right? So basically, what I talk about is measuring kind of size of government or kind of level of central planning or whatever you call it, not in terms of kind of the raw impact of interventions relative to some kind of theoretical natural status quo, but rather just thinking about it in terms of complexity, right? So thinking about it in terms of, well, how many knobs are there that actually need to be adjusted, right? So like if you look at a system like Bitcoin, well, there's actually not too many knobs. You know, you have kind of the rate at which the cryptocurrency get mined, like the rate at which new blocks come in, and a few other things. But if you start trying to create a system that admits a kind of much more regular and active kind of central control, then you're basically creating a system where you have a lot of knobs, right? And instead of the knobs being kind of turned once and then set fixed forever, the knobs kind of continue. There's a lot of them and they continue being tunable for a long time. And my thesis is basically that kind of the risk is greater when there's more knobs, right? And like the things that about kind of social engineering that we consider to be bad basically come from trying to create systems with too many knobs. And we kind of compare this to overfitting in kind of machine learning, right? So where you create, you start off with like 100 cases that you use as your training data, and then given those 100 cases of experience, you come up with a model. And if your model overfits, then your model kind of does a really good job of fitting those precise 100 cases. But then when it hits some kind of new 101st situation that's not one of those exact 100, it just kind of flies completely off and does something crazy, right? Whereas if you build a system that's more simple, then the system, like it might not be as perfect on the data that you trained it, and it might even be substantially worse, but it's more likely to be kind of robust to things that are very kind of unexpected, right? So
right.
it's
because
about,
if you're having to optimize too many metrics, there's way more room for interference or like distortions in what you're trying to do.
And you can just get it wrong.
Right.
Yeah, and well, so first of all, you could just get it wrong. And second of all, if you're designing a system in the context of there being kind of warring social factions, then the more knobs you have, then the more opportunities each of those factions have to do things that kind of secretly benefits itself.
Yeah, and the more incentive they have to try to seize control of the central decision-making process.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. Your point on markets, or sorry, your point on the discovery versus the invention of Bitcoin reminds me a little bit about discussions I've had on markets and whether we should consider markets to be kind of natural phenomena or in some sense created. You make, I think it's in the post you mentioned, correct me if I'm wrong, but you make the point that private property, in the way that we think of it, is like a highly interventionist social technology or social institution. But we, like, it has a very defined space that it's operating in, we could say. And so the intervention is not a problem, essentially, if we're trying to create markets. But there's an underlying thing there that markets themselves can be thought of as socially engineered. Is that how you think about markets in general?
Yeah, and it depends, I guess, because people use the word markets to mean different things, right? Like there's kind of the market, which is this kind of abstraction of just the facts that people have the ability to trade with each other, which is in some ways just kind of a fact and it's always true. And then there's markets as in kind of specific practices and specific institutions that have to do with facilitating trading, right? So like the Apple App Store is a market, and a stock market is a market, a cryptocurrency exchange is a market. These things are kind of also markets, and there's definitely kind of lots of different institutions and kind of practices that exist in society that have to do with basically making it easier for people to trade. So like there's both aspects to it, right? There's the facts that like people can and are gonna trade, and people, you know, even just develop trading practices even in prisons if that's what benefits them. But you know, on the other hand, there's definitely there is such a thing as what economists call market structure, and there's kind of institutions that can significantly influence outcomes.
Yeah, I mean, I would guess that prison markets are probably highly interventionist, but something that interests me here though is that when we talk about markets, one of the strengths is obviously that the risk of overfitting in a lot of cases is less severe. That's probably a very mechanical way of talking about decentralization. On the other hand, there's, I think, this, you know, in the Bay Area, and especially when crypto was getting started, there has historically been this sort of libertarian kind of cypherpunk subculture that I think animated the way a lot of people were thinking about these things. I'm interested to hear, do you think that culture is still relevant, or is it dead, essentially? Do we have to get something else now?
Ooh, I mean, libertarianism in general as a thing has definitely kind of gone through complicated transformations. Like I remember, you know, 2010 to 2013 was basically when I first kind of just started paying attention to the political trends at all. And that was when there was the early Bitcoin community, and then there was kind of libertarianism as a thing. And it was this nice kind of cohesive thing. But then over the kind of 7 years that followed, it definitely kind of went through a lot of kind of splits and convulsions, right? So like a lot of people went off to a kind of a less libertarian right, and you know, you see kind of Trump as being one expression of that. And you know, in the like Bitcoin space, for example, you have people like Nick Szabo who kind of went off in more that direction. And then you know, you also had in the mainstream libertarian world people who kind of moved over and became kind of post-libertarians or neoliberals or the Niskanen Center or like neo-radicals and kind of Glenn Weil followers and whoever else. So there definitely has been a kind of in the mainstream libertarian world that kind of split into two camps. On the kind of specifically tech and cyber side, I think the big story kind of what's happened over the last maybe 10 to 15 years is basically that kind of the internet started behaving less like a separate country and more like basically just part of the world. Like maybe 15 years ago, like the internet was like, you know, there were internet people, and internet people had kind of internet kind of opinions that were in a particular direction distinct from kind of old world opinions. And that dynamic, it definitely existed kind of all the way through the 2000s, but then as just more and more of the world came onto the internet over the last 10 years, like that ended up kind of significantly weakening in a lot of ways. And so like you definitely don't have kind of exactly the same idea of let's have kind of cyberspace be this kind of completely separate realm.
Meat space becomes a carrier vehicle for things happening online, so to speak.
Right. Yeah. And the two realms definitely interact more with each other. And I think the general idea that kind of the internet is an important vehicle for freedom, and the idea that the internet is kind of the closest thing to a politically neutral space that the humanity has left, is definitely something that people have continued to believe and continue to think is important. But
do you think of it as politically neutral? If anything, it seems to be driving, people talk about it as like a force for polarization.
Well, okay,
like so.
I'll qualify by saying that 20 years ago, the thing that cypherpunks were excited about is the internet itself, and now the thing that they're getting excited about is kind of specifically the blockchain space.
I see.
And the internet, the kind of the centralized internet, has definitely kind of failed at being politically neutral. And I mean, I actually think, and that's definitely a trend that's going to kind of continue. And like one thing that people I think don't realize is that I think kind of US tech platforms benefited from a lot of goodwill, kind of in part because they were kind of not really touched by the government much, kind of especially internationally. And now, of course, that's changing. And now, of course, kind of there's a lot of back and forth interaction, and if centralized tech ecosystems are definitely not going to be capable of kind of being independent from the political environment they're based in. But like people definitely do see blockchains as basically being kind of the last hope for an alternative in some sense.
But what, like, I'm interested in your own ideological self-conception, I guess. Sure. There was this era of autonomous individuals and digital republics, and this sense of a sort of radical, technologically driven liberation. Do you see yourself as in any way continuing this idea, or have you branched into something very distinctive?
I would say definitely kind of continuing, but with very significant changes. So I think like one of the major changes, right, is that the kinds of technology that kind of cypherpunks were pushing in the kind of early 2000s that have to do with like basically communication, like pirating things, like downloading whatever you want, people talking to each other in censorship-resistant ways, and all of these things. I mean, I don't think it's fair to call them entirely individualistic. Like they do ultimately have to do with people kind of interacting with each other, but they're definitely kind of a little bit more individualistic. And then we moved on to currencies, and currencies are definitely kind of less individualistic than communication systems. And the reason why I say that is because like a communication system, what does not need is it does not need to have a kind of shared state, right? It doesn't need to have this kind of shared thing that everyone agrees on and that kind of follows along everyone. Right. Like if you have a communication network, it splits in half, both halves just keep on going. But with a currency, there is this kind of single thing, there is this kind of set of rules and database that everyone has to agree on. And so like just because of that, it's forced to be a kind of a community to a certain extent.
Yeah, it's a more social project.
Yeah, and what we've been seeing is that like especially kind of second generation things that will come after are kind of even more social, right? So it's
right.
I guess like definitely much less of the kind of sovereign individual and much more digital republic, I would say.
I see.
So are you sort of like there's this theme underlying all of this of kind of like a libertarian desire to get away from a lot of these things that are inherently these social politicized systems, but it sounds like in some way you're kind of having to make peace with the degree of sort of sociality of a lot of these modes of interaction, or a lot of these things that just necessarily end up being social.
That's definitely very true.
Like,
Okay.
I know Glenn embraces the labels of radical and liberal. My sense is that in part this is a recognition of the social nature of a lot of what he's doing. Like, is this a frame that you've embraced as well?
Yeah, and radical liberal is definitely kind of interesting phrasing, right? Because, and first of all, it's kind of this idea of continuing this kind of 200-year-old tradition of liberalism, and kind of the economists from the 1800s kind of all the way through to like what people have in the 1900s and up to today. And then there's kind of radical in the sense that, there's radical in the sense of like people talk about radical as in kind of left-leaning, or radical as in just pushing for something very significant and not just incremental. And then there's radical as in kind of going back to the roots, right? Because, you know, radical comes from the Latin word radix, meaning root. And like radical liberal, and then there's the other kind of fun math pun in there, which is that quadratic voting and quadratic funding and like involve actual square roots. But it's definitely kind of an interesting frame. I think the blockchain space is I definitely don't want to say that like the blockchain space is the same thing as liberal radicalism. Like, I'm definitely interested in both, but I definitely don't want to kind of pretend that they're the same thing. And there's a lot of like, even Glenn himself is kind of fairly skeptical of a lot of blockchain things, and then there's a lot of blockchain people that are skeptical of Glenn. And then even in the Ethereum community, we have kind of old traditional style of anarcho-capitalists who are definitely not into Harberger taxing everything. So there's like, those two things are definitely different, and they have a similar spirit in terms of valuing decentralization is a big one. Also, just kind of being forward thinking and trying to kind of create something new. And I guess being radical in that sense is another one. And then, along with decentralization, like valuing kind of individual freedom and a lot of those kind of connected things. But yeah, at the same time, there's differences. So, one of the differences, for example, is that like Glenn Weil style radical liberalism, a big part of the intent is explicitly to basically to convince governments to implement different things. Whereas part of what the blockchain space is trying to do is kind of create a new substrate that's more independent of governments.
So route around some of this.
So that's something I'd love to talk about a little bit more. So like the libertarian interpretation of a lot of this stuff is sort of very obvious, right? Like kind of removing these centralized bureaucratic systems. But a lot of these projects, and it's reflected in what you're saying about how Glenn Weil is approaching it, they also make sense from the perspective of the central power in society or the state or something, right? So these bureaucratic agencies, not only do they create kind of these rent-seeking problems for normal people, they're also a principal agent problem for the state, right? Like if you can actually get rid of some bureaucracy by replacing it with a decentralized system, that's it needs less governance. It needs less like political management and so on. So there's this obvious kind of other perspective coming in, the synergy where like somehow the libertarian and the state perspective can agree on a lot of these projects. So that's very interesting. But I'd love to hear more about how you see the relationship between these projects and the state and existing power structures.
Yeah, no, I think like first of all, it's I think really important to note that kind of states and institutions in general are not monolithic. Like I came into the space with this kind of libertarian zeitgeist that basically it says that like everyone in a government is either evil or just kind of stuffy and boring and kind of not capable of being interested in new and interesting ideas. And people in banks and large corporations are basically the same. But then I started actually talking to those people. And I quickly discovered that, well, no, in every bank, there's a lot of people who are actually excited about the idea of like, do we want to have even a world with no banks? There's even inside of governments, there's always people who are excited about the idea of, well, ultimately, I'm not here to preserve the tool. I'm here to kind of do the tool's purpose. And if we can completely redesign the way that we serve the purpose, then I'm totally cool with that. There's plenty of people with that mindset in lots of governments around the world everywhere. So I think like realizing that has kind of definitely been kind of important for myself. And so I think like a lot of people in the crypto space have this mindset that kind of it's decentralization against the state, and kind of agents of the state are like an enemy. And I think that's like in many cases totally incorrect. Like just there's a lot of people inside of the kind of even the institutions that these technologies are ostensibly trying to kind of radically change or replace that are totally open-minded and interested in some of these ideas. So I think kind of that's the first thing, right? So kind of I don't think this view of like necessarily treating big institutions as organs that are kind of singularly dedicated to kind of self-preservation of every one of their functions is an especially correct view. I think they're kind of internally very heterogeneous. There's lots of people pushing in like lots of different directions, and there's people excited about radical exchange and people excited about Ethereum and people excited about Bitcoin and all of these things in the kind of far-flung corners of like just about everywhere that you can find. So I think that's one important lesson. And then the other important lesson is definitely that like in many cases, even kind of institutions as an institution don't want to kind of have the power that they have necessarily, just precisely because if power isn't just power, power is also a liability. And
yeah, you wrote an article. You wrote an article called "Control is Liability," I think.
Exactly. Yeah, and I think like in the context, especially if you kind of branch away from say governments and into like corporations, there's plenty of context in which corporations like explicitly wants to have less control, precisely because in an arrangement where they do have control, they know that they're going to like people don't trust them, and so whatever system they build, it's either going to get regulated to hell or possibly no one's even going to join them in the first place. And so like using decentralization to like basically build a system where they are involved in building it and they're even an early participant in it, but they don't control it, is something that is appealing to a lot of people.
That's that's a fascinating claim you're making, though, and I think it's really counterintuitive. It seems like when I think about it, a lot of organizations, and not just governments, but companies as well, want like control but not liability, if that makes sense. So I can think, for example, of traditional banking institutions where if they have the chance to write their own regulations, that's great, because especially if you're a big bank, you can now weaponize the regulations to keep out competitors. Obviously direct control over various kinds of financial tools. But then on the other hand, if there's a big screw up, as there was in 2008, for example, you cede the liability and you can basically get bailed out. Do you think that distinction between like control and liability is the key thing here, or is there something else you're seeing?
I think if people can get control without having liability, they'll definitely snap it up. Like back in like 2009 and 2010, for example, and there's a reason why even Silicon Valley was not that excited about decentralizing itself, right? Because it saw that it has the reins of power, and it didn't really look like there was a significant risk that governments would like take those reins of power away. Like things like Section 230 seemed much more secure back then than they are today. And so like Mark Zuckerberg and Jack Dorsey kind of having the master key was for Max Zuckerberg and kind of the safest arrangement, right? And
yeah. The thing I'm trying to reconcile here, I guess, is that we seem to see organizations trying to expand something, some kind of interest or power or control. But it does sound correct that obviously you don't want to be liable for the things you do. So I'm trying to get this sort of straightened out.
Right.
What you're saying seems to make sense.
I think both tendencies exist. And like, I think, like Twitter recently released kind of like Blue Sky, which is their own internal effort at basically trying to make a basically decentralized Twitter protocol. And as far as I can tell, I think that's genuine and it's not just a marketing gimmick. So I think, and then Jack Dorsey is kind of very public about his kind of interest in Bitcoin and cryptocurrency, right? I mean, I think he even has Bitcoin on his Twitter tag, or bio. So, and there's definitely people that are kind of ideologically interested. Yeah, I don't know. And both tendencies exist, and there's kind of a lot of different factors that add and subtract and interact in complicated ways. But I think the fact that there are these factors that add and subtract and interact in complicated ways is already enough to basically ensure that it's definitely not true that the entire establishment is united against the idea of decentralization taking over. And maybe that kind of lack of unified opposition is all it needs.
Yeah, and it's really interesting to look at the case of Twitter in particular. I don't know the logic from the inside of the company there, but you could imagine it being, they want to wash their hands of all this political fighting. There is a lot of political fighting about who does Twitter censor, who does it platform, et cetera, et cetera. If they can pass it off to this decentralized mechanism where they no longer have control, then that fighting no longer has to occur inside their office. So it's a lot less headaches for them.
Yeah. We do have a couple more questions we want to get to before the Q&A, so I'm going to move it along. So you work on a lot of different policy and mechanism design work with Radical Exchange and in your writing. We can't get through everything in this discussion, but one that we did want to talk about was the quadratic funding mechanism. So you've talked about quadratic funding as a way to determine and fund public goods. I'm interested to hear more about this mechanism, and in particular about how you're implementing this with Gitcoin grants.
Yeah, so the basic idea behind quadratic funding, right, is that it's this mechanism where anyone can kind of announce that they have a project and their project is a public good and they want to get funded. And anyone has the ability to contribute to projects. And the idea behind the mechanism is that it tries to just use people's contributions themselves as a way of detecting, basically, which projects actually are public goods and which projects are just pet projects only benefit one person, right? And so the basic formula that it uses is, well, if there's a project and person A donates to the project and person B also donates to the project, then it means that that project is kind of simultaneously valuable to those two people, right? And the first person is only thinking about the benefit to themselves, right? They're not thinking about the benefit to the other person. And the second person is not thinking about the benefit to the first person. And so there's this tragedy of the commons effect if you just rely on donations, where person A and person B will both end up donating basically less than the optimal amount, because when they're donating, they're only considering kind of the benefit to them personally, and they possibly don't even know that the other person exists, right? So what quadratic funding does is it says, well, for every project and for every kind of pair of people who contribute to the same project, you basically kind of add in a subsidy that compensates for the tragedy of the commons, right? So if you have a project that has 2 or more people contributing, there's a subsidy that gets added on top, and that subsidy goes up the more money that people donate, and that subsidy goes up kind of quadratically. So with the square, the more people contribute to that project.
Yeah, and I just want to kind of be clear on a point here, because this is something that wasn't immediately obvious. The idea here is that the more people are donating, i.e. the more people are benefiting from a public good, kind of all else equal, the more funding that venture is going to get, correct?
Exactly. So for example, if there's some public good that kind of 2 people contribute $1 to, then the match would be like $1, or basically the formula is like you take the square roots and then you add the square roots and you take the square. So you'll go up you get up to 4. So the subsidy might be $1. Then if 30 people contribute, then, you know, it's a kind of a 30 times 30 squared. So the subsidy could go up to $900. So the subsidy kind of goes up quadratically with like basically the more people contribute. And the idea here, yeah.
So, sorry, where does the subsidy come from?
Right. So quadratic funding, so in public goods funding, there's kind of 2 sub-problems, right? The first sub-problem is, well, where does the money to fund the thing come from? And the second sub-problem is, well, how do you actually decide what's a real public good and what's just a single person's pet project? Quadratic funding kind of explicitly solves the second problem, but does not solve the first problem, right? So quadratic funding does require there to be some kind of pool of kind of extra subsidy funding that's there in order to just be used for funding public goods. So, I mean, in the case, the reason why it's interesting, right, is that there's a lot of contexts where there is kind of funding that's supposed to be dedicated to like basic public goods within a community. So a government of a country is one obvious example. There could be just some wealthy philanthropist who decides like, I care about this community and I want to support it, but I don't know exactly what are all the tiny things that these people care about. So I want to just donate to a matching pool. And even cryptocurrencies themselves, for example, right? Like one of the big problems that cryptocurrencies have, right, is that like you have this public goods funding problem in that development of like software, protocol research, and all of these things are often very underfunded. But at the same time, there's one public good, which is like basically network security, that's funded very well, right? Like there's billions of dollars every year going into mining Bitcoin or mining Ether and securing those 2 networks. So why is like the one public good that is network security funded really well, and why are all the other public goods funded very badly? Well, basically because we know and we have a consensus that network security is important, but with everything other than network security, like we don't really have any idea, you know, what's actually like, how do you even measure like what is valuable work, like what is valuable research and what is valuable development? And so quadratic funding, you know, it could be very useful to solve like that problem in particular.
Well, and I want to just touch on this because on the political theory side of this, there's an interesting thing being done here, especially when you compare it to quadratic voting, which we're not going to get into that on this salon, but essentially it's applying a similar quadratic logic to voting from a list of options on a ballot. And you know, if I understand what you were doing here correctly, right? The problem with the ballot is that someone has chosen what's on that ballot. And so there's kind of a role there that there's still control. And my understanding of what you're doing is you're trying to like decentralize even the discussion of what is being voted on. Is that correct?
Exactly.
Why was this important to you though? Explain the goal here a little bit.
I think like, for the use case of public goods funding in particular, right? The number of public goods that we have in society is just immense, right? There's, I mean, a lot of people talk about public goods as though there's like a finite list, and it's like, oh, you know, you got your clean air and your national defense and your roads and your education and like either 3 or 30 other things, depending on whether you're a liberal or a conservative. But like the reality is that public goods are everywhere, and even in the most kind of pro-government spending places, there's just a huge amount of them that never ends up getting kind of the support that they deserve. So, I mean, international scientific research, blogs, kind of cultural works, educational materials, kind of free media of pretty much any kind, open source software, translations, and the list and media to give kind of a really topical one that's been like really hurt by a lack of a good incentive model. So journalism. So there's like the number of public goods that we have is huge, and especially in kind of the information world, kind of on the internet. Like on the internet, there's basically more public goods than private goods, right? On the internet, like most things that people do are in the form of like manipulating bits. And once you upload some bits, anyone can kind of reshare and eventually download and have them. And so like there's this really interesting irony that the cypherpunk movement started being like very kind of capitalism and private property maximalist, and kind of thinking that these institutions of kind of markets that are designed around one-to-one trade could be should basically run everything. But at the same time, like the internet world that the cypherpunks inhabit is like the single biggest kind of concentration of public goods that there is in some sense, like because like almost everything is public and almost nothing is private.
I've seen the chat saying Palladium is a public good. I just want to formally endorse this.
Yeah, no, Palladium is a public good. It's a public awesome.
We're quoting that.
See. So basically the like public goods are kind of as numerous and like as complex as private goods essentially. And so if you're going to have a political system that basically says, well, we're going to have like we're only going to give just people in the public like one or 10 bits of choice in terms of like basically how they can influence the government, then you're really not like you're missing a huge amount of information about what's important to people, right? And I think I mean, democracy in general, like, and the fact that it collects some input from the public is good, but like one bit of input every 4 years, or even 5 bits of input every 2 years, is not nearly enough to kind of capture the amount of information that people have about the world, right? Like, you can't really capture like all of the different kind of smaller things that people value, like everything that's kind of too small to be a significant part of some grand national discussion. You can't really capture like how strongly people feel about things. And so, and like one of the reasons people like protests, like for example, is that protesting does like basically give you a way of saying, not only do I care about something, I care about something enough to actually go out and pay a personal cost to express my support for it. So I think having more kind of institutions in public that let people provide different ways of like expressing how much they value like different things, including large scale things, including small scale things, but also including this like real kind of forgotten category of medium scale things, right? Like our political discourse often kind of creates this dichotomy where we have like a private market and a public government, and you know everything is either a private good or a public good. But you know the reality is there's this like big huge array of things that just benefit thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people.
Yeah, and not everyone, but enough.
Exactly.
Kind of.
Yeah, and there's like we're just not capturing that much information at all about how much people value those things. And like with quadratic funding, and we've going back to Gitcoin grants, like we have basically experimented using it kind of within the Ethereum ecosystem, and we ended up discovering a lot of things about what people in the Ethereum community value and feel is important. So like people support projects around like community outreach, like marketing, education, and YouTube channels, Twitter accounts, like things that for a kind of admittedly sometimes a bit too technocratic Ethereum, like we try not to be technocratic, but you know, admittedly still inevitably somewhat technocratic Ethereum Foundation like is just never going to realize that deserves support by itself, right? Like you know, grant making bodies generally are not going to just by themselves admit that YouTube channels and Twitter accounts are valuable, and yet you know a lot of people kind of think they are valuable, and I think, and like on reflection, I think those people are often correct. So
I'm gonna have to jump in there, Vitalik, because I know we have a lot of good questions waiting. So there's a lot of points I'd love to get into there. Maybe we can do it in the Q&A. There is one more question I do want to ask you though before we get to that. You've had the opportunity, as we've kind of mentioned, to work with a number of governments to various extents: Taiwan, Canada, the state of Colorado, you know, maybe others you could name. There's a lot of people, I think, especially on the West Coast, where there are a lot of ideas about how to disrupt or upgrade governance institutions. We try to forward a lot of those discussions. But one of the things that has come up repeatedly is that a lot of people in tech, you know, are not good at interfacing with governments and with institutions of power. So maybe just take like 1 or 2 minutes on this, but I think it'd be valuable. What is like the best lesson that you've learned on how to interact with those kinds of institutions?
And I think one of the big lessons that I've learned is the thing that I've already said, which is like basically don't overestimate how much they hate you, because often they really don't. And then just don't overestimate the extent to which they're different from, or people in government are different from just any other people you might encounter. And I like people in government ultimately are people, and there's people in government that can definitely get excited about the thing that you're excited about.
Are you giving them like a sales pitch, or are you building a relationship, or how does that work for you?
It depends, and a lot of the time they come to us.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and a lot.
How would they hear about you? Just through word of mouth, or?
So in the context of Ethereum, I mean, people in government definitely read the media. Like I was even told by people in the Singapore government explicitly that like some of them follow my Twitter.
Oh, cool.
I mean, there's people in like a lot of governments that follow my Twitter. And they read about blockchains. They know about blockchains. And they often just wants to hear and learn things. I think if they wants to hear and learn things, like it's it's never harmful to be friendly.
So with that, let's move on to the audience Q&A. These have been a great discussion so far, but we got some great questions from our audience as well. So Chelsea Voss asks, a lot of economic production is tied up in fields that are protected by guilds. For example, the law system in the US is protected by the bar. The health system is protected by the American Medical Association, and they both artificially constrict the supply of lawyers and doctors. Is there any hope of decentralizing these fields or breaking up their guilds? Are there mechanisms that you've been looking at that might help with that you've been getting excited about?
There's definitely people trying to kind of create decentralized alternatives to a lot of these kind of very institutionalized functions. And so one of the more kind of the ones that I've seen that have more progress, there is actually a kind of decentralized arbitration. So basically, like if you have two participants that have some business deal and they have an agreement, or possibly if you want to have an agreement where one of the terms in that agreement is like some fact about the real world, like, what is the price of some asset, or even like, does some item get shipped based on UPS tracking numbers and all of these things. Like basically there's a thing that some people in the crypto space is doing is they're trying to actually kind of create these decentralized arbitration systems so that instead of having to just do everything through a kind of like a legal system and like courts and judges and all of these things, you basically just have a DAO, and the participants in the DAO just end up like hearing the facts and like basically voting on what the correct outcome is. And they kind of offer arbitration as this kind of very generic kind of API style thing that you can just plug into, whether you're making some bespoke business deal or you're an e-commerce website or you're whatever else. So that's one kind of interesting example of just that kind of disruption that people are trying. Insurance is another example. So like this isn't true in every case, but there are limited kinds of insurance. So like often what's called parametric insurance, where it's insurance that's based on that's based around like pieces of data that you can get from the real world. So like insurance that automatically pays out if there's a flood, financial derivatives, and for insurance that automatically pays out if there's a hurricane, if something happens to some airplane flight. Like these are things that you just can do with smart contracts, and people are trying to do with smart contracts. I know there's also people trying to use blockchains to create kind of things like rotating savings and credit associations. So like basically create kind of smart contract clubs where people kind of put money together into a central pool, and then there's rules around like when people can take money out of a central pool. I mean, people even just use multi-sig wallets, like wallets where you have, say, like 7 people that have keys and you need 4 of them to move the funds, as a complete alternative to setting up legal organizations in a lot of cases. And like, if you have just a fairly small amount of money, or a medium amount of money where you have trust problems, but you don't want to go through all the work of setting up an entity, and you just want something that's like simple and reasonably robust, it's often a good solution. So I haven't seen things in the like medical doctor context or like professional consulting context yet, but I'm sure things are coming for just about every industry.
Cool.
Chris Robotham has a question on states, using the digital space. So are efforts like Russia's attempt to build a sovereign Russian internet a passing fad, or are these a very meaningful show of force?
I definitely think that nation states are going to kind of get into the building big internet platforms game. Building a kind of separate internets as a somewhat different story. And so far, I'm definitely still expecting that kind of connectivity to the global internet through fairly easily available channels is something that's going to persist just because there's too much demand for it. And even if it ends up like being kind of formally restricted, there would still be ways that are ways to access the global internet that are like at best as illegal as say weed was 5 years ago.
Right, like VPNs in China and this kind of thing.
Yeah, that sort of thing. But then in terms of nation states are definitely, I think, going to kind of push hard into the building their own platforms. And central bank issued digital currencies are a big example of this. So, you have China with a DCEP, you have the US Federal Reserve getting interested in building some kind of digital currency. There's Singapore, they had their project Ubin, and they're continuing to push forward on things. And I think the reason for that is that people are just seeing that kind of money, like in order to just be efficient enough for people to use this century, is going to have to be natively digital. And natively digital things are just naturally competitive. And so pretty much every government wants to kind of get ahead of the game and to get their own thing in there so that they have an opportunity at kind of getting that international space for themselves. So I think there's that aspect. I also think there's the aspect that, and as I kind of alluded to earlier, maybe 10 years ago, people kind of trusted things like Facebook and Twitter to be reasonably independent of the US government. And so even in a lot of countries that are kind of distrustful of the US, they were kind of medium fine with the fact that Facebook and Twitter existed. But now, distrust of the United States is increasing, and distrust of tech companies' ability to resist the United States government is increasing. And so I think the narrative of like, we have to build our own thing in order to basically not be vassals of the US thing is something that's going to grow. That doesn't mean that nation states are going to necessarily build like their own social platforms or whatever directly. It could be indirects. They could be kind of subsidized or encouraged, or a whole bunch of kind of tactics along the spectrum. So, I think a lot of that is going to happen. And one of the reasons why I'm kind of really interested in blockchain specifically is just the fact that in this world of kind of nationalized, centralized tech platforms, I think decentralized platforms do have this very unique kind of global position that still allows them to stay kind of considerably more neutral than anything else can. But yeah, at the same time, the states are definitely going to keep moving forward.
So on the question of decentralized social media in particular, Samo Burya has a question about this. So he has the idea that sort of breaking them up in a naive way is kind of wishful thinking. Like, you can't have a Facebook for California and a separate one for New York because of Metcalfe's law, about the value of networks going up with the square of the number of users. But we do seem to get that effect with say Russia or Iran having their own social media. How do you see the factors kind of how do you see decentralization actually going to get around this law? And What are the factors that make this work or not work?
So I think there's two kinds of decentralization that you have to kind of talk about separately. One is decentralization through just creating more platforms that each have a smaller number of users that people can choose between. And the other is between creating like single platforms or single protocols that are more decentralized internally. So I think kind of along in terms of the first, in terms of kind of would things fragment more, I think the pressure for people to just want to be able to communicate with other people halfway across the world and kind of be part of the same social ecosystem and the same intellectual ecosystem as large fractions of the world population is just like too large to just ignore or try to put the genie back in the bottle, I guess. So and the places it'll persist, like I have this general perspective that I think to the extent that the world remains divided, I think the main thing that'll divide it is language. Like language is to the internet what kind of distance is to the physical world. And I mean, people do say that like, oh, we'll have translations and in 5 years that'll fix everything. But like having actually learned a bunch of languages to varying extents and having actually used these translation tools, like I definitely disagree. I think we're definitely still much further away from that being a reality than a lot of people think. And like even a tiny barrier is enough to kind of cause ecosystems to diverge. But so in terms of like, basically, I think if you want to move toward an ecosystem where you have more smaller platforms, you can only do that by creating some kind of common layer that kind of absorbs some of the functions that have that used to have network effects. So like one example of this is even just like people use like a Google and Facebook and Twitter to log into like many kinds of services, right? So you have a kind of more centralized account management that that has big problems, and we can talk about that, but it does enable kind of more decentralization at other layers because other layers don't have to worry about those issues and don't have to worry about like, oh, people are not going to use a new service because they don't want to create a new account because they already have an account. So that's something. So basically, the more things you can socialize, kind of the more the rest of the layers can decentralize it essentially, right? So if you kind of socialize account management, then you can decentralize other things a little bit more. If you can socialize like the ability to like filter out bad content, then you could get like more in terms of just like for example, having like actually not socialize necessarily, sorry, if you want to socialize the communication layer so that you can have kind of more diversity and things like content moderation layers, for example. That's so
my sense though, sorry, go ahead and finish your thought.
I'm just saying, like even things like browser extensions, for example. So like basically I think coming up with ways of like actually getting those network effects without having the central controller or with having kind of more limited central controllers, like is something that you just need to do in order to get diversity and kind of the rest of the parts of the ecosystem.
I just want to say, like, I think Samo's question in part is getting at like what the goal of a country is in trying to do some of these initiatives. And my sense is not so much that they are trying to block out the foreign internet, but rather that they want to have sufficient internal infrastructure that the US, if it gains control over tech companies, can't just shut their internet off. Like maybe they can turn off 40 or 60%, but there will be this sovereign core that will allow digital operations to go on. Do you think that's accurate?
My interactions with like government people in Russia and China suggest that that's definitely a large part of the story. And like, there's definitely the part of the story that says that they themselves want to have more control, but fearing outside control is definitely a kind of like a very big motivator as well.
So we got another question from the audience from Pasha Kamyshev. there's this argument that goes around that technology is inherently somewhat socially centralizing because it seems to extend the ability of people to communicate with each other. It extends the ability of governments and other factions to wield power. It's usually an extending force rather than a more defensive thing. So do you think that technology has that centralizing effect? And if not, how do we distinguish between, say, centralizing and decentralizing technologies, or both happening at the same time somehow? Very curious to hear this.
I guess my counter question would be, do you think the world is more centralized in 2020 or in 1943? I'd say 1943.
That's a very interesting question.
It depends on it seems like it depends on the vector of centralization. In terms of legibility of our lives, it's certainly more centralized today. But in terms of perhaps like heavy productive industry, 1943.
Right.
It seems like today we care a lot about the legibility of our lives because of big data and these sorts of things.
Right. I think the challenge, like one of the reasons why it's kind of hard to parse this stuff out is because like the thing that technology does is it makes everybody more powerful. And so if you measure centralization or decentralization by the lack of like people you dislike being powerful, then you're going to keep losing because the people you dislike are going to keep being more powerful and the people you like are also going to keep being more powerful, essentially. Right? So like basically going from 1943 to 2020, well, it's not fair to say we have bigger government because government in 1943 was like very, very big for obvious reasons. But like we definitely have bigger markets, and we definitely have more the government having more data legibility. At the same time, we also see the people having more legibility, right? And the people having more ability to see what's going on in the world and kind of being less vulnerable to just complete misinformation is arguably an example of decentralization as well. And I think the answer is basically that kind of the top and the bottom are both getting more powerful, and that's why you see the conflicting narratives.
I'm going to move on to another question. So Jeff asks, when people are trying to design coordination mechanisms such as blockchain, should they do so with the expectation that how those coordination mechanisms are used depends on the choices of present and future elites? So, do we have to think of the power holders in society when we're designing these things?
And elites definitely are going to have like a lot of influence in pretty much any system you build. Though, I mean, at the same time, I think we're building systems that are explicitly trying to kind of empower other people other than elites. So, I guess ultimately, when you build a system, you have to think about pretty much every kind of actor that can have some kind of influence in it, right? Like you have to think about how all of the individual kind of like lower level participants will interface with it. You have to think about how the elites will interface with it. You have to think about what kinds of side games people will come up with that try to kind of strategically organize around this kind of to better prosper within the system. And then those kind of side games are going to have games inside of them. Right, like if you build an electoral system, someone will build a political party, and then you have the U.S. in 2016 and 2020, where the game inside the political party is as important as the game between the political parties. And you have to consider all layers of the stack.
I mean, in particular, it seems like opposition would be a big one here, right? If you are changing a voting system, I mean, people in various democratic countries, especially with something like proportional representation, right? This is a topic that comes up in a number of countries regularly. But the thing is, when you change the system that got certain people in power, they're usually not going to just quietly accede, right, to the great new idea.
Yeah, no, that's true. And I think you definitely, well, the kind of ideal thing to do, right, is that like if you want to push a reform that's kind of efficiency improving, but at the same time kind of rejuggles things a bunch, then if you just push it directly, then of course the people that just happen to lose in the short term are going to oppose you. But if you can ideally kind of put everyone behind the Rawlsian veil and kind of let them like basically not see which side of the game they're going to be. And then like if it's an efficiency improving form, then a reform, then in theory everyone would support it. Like basically because like some people will, are going to get hurt, but on average it benefits almost everyone. So the challenge is like, what's a deployment strategy that looks more like a Rawlsian veil than just releasing or proposing to release the thing in the present. So one thing that helps is delaying, right? Like if you push for a reform that only activates 15 years from now, then that's a little bit or significantly more Rawlsian veil-like than pushing for a reform that activates tomorrow. And so pushing for reforms in a way where you kind of start small and then you expand them over time, I think naturally has that effect, right? Like the way we're pushing quadratic funding is that we're not saying that like, oh, big governments should just immediately rip out all of their public goods funding agencies and replace them with a quadratic fund or a UBI tomorrow. We're saying, oh, here, we're going to try it out in our own little Ethereum bubble, and then we're going to talk to people in Colorado and try it out in the Colorado bubble, and then we might talk to people in Taiwan, and we might talk to people in Canada, and kind of go out and expand from there. And realistically, it actually probably will take like at least a decade for like really large scale quadratic funds to happen.
My sense though is you have a strong optimism in the willingness of people and institutions to update. Is that accurate?
I guess even if I were pessimistic, I would probably it would probably still be optimal for me to act like an optimist. Just because ultimately you have to try
pessimism
to do
of the intellect, optimism of the will. A quote that I had in my Twitter bio for a while.
And I think we definitely do needs to be kind of just going at this with the mindset that kind of things can and will change significantly. I mean, if it all ends up being a failed effort, then I guess fine. Like at least we tried. But I think like the benefits are potentially like really large, and so I think we all should be trying. And
yeah, absolutely.
Palladium magazine is about trying, right? Governance futurism, not governance stagnationism.
So another question from Samo. You're well known for your philanthropic efforts, in particular sponsoring research in social sciences and some existential risk. How do you evaluate which undervalued areas are worth supporting? How do you choose where to put your money?
A lot of it was just listening to the effective altruist community. Like they did a lot of kind of research on like basically where do you help people the most with like what are the cause areas where you can do the most help per dollar, and they kind of settled down on global public health is a big one. And so like some of my biggest donations were to either give directly into the Against Malaria Foundation, and anti-aging research that like I donate to the Sense Foundation is also a potentially really big one. And then anti-aging research has been making huge strides in the last couple of years, and that's definitely kind of much less of a laughingstock field than it was 10 years ago when I first got excited about it. And then existential risk research, and basically just even if the probability is small, like multiplied by an even tiny chance of helping 8 billion people and 800 trillion future people survive. The math is kind of obvious on that. So that kind of reasoning definitely kind of helped me along. And there's also just projects that I kind of identify as being promising just through all of the different communities that I interact with. Like I've contributed to the Radical Exchange Foundation itself, for example, also a couple of other smaller organizations. And then obviously things within the Ethereum ecosystem and some kind of academic research things.
Okay. We have another question here from Pasha. Why do you think prediction markets aren't more widely popular? We had Robin Hanson on a while ago talking about some of this as well.
A couple of reasons, I think. And one of them is just that kind of the interfaces to prediction markets suck. Like for the centralized ones, like it's not necessarily easy to kind of get money in and they get money out. For the decentralized ones, like, well, you have to have cryptocurrency. Now, why aren't they more popular within the set of cryptocurrency users? Then you start to get to the second question, which is that, well, part of it is that it's a kind of bootstrapping problem. Like if the markets are thin, nobody wants to participate in the markets. Right. Another part is just that, like, from a rational actor point of view, right, it doesn't really, like, and from an outside view point of view, it doesn't really make sense to participate in a prediction market because, like, an average participant in a prediction market loses money. And, well, they get zero when they lose a bit of money because of, like, the fees and transaction fees and time spent. And so how do you know you're one of the better ones, essentially? And, like, humans, of course, are naturally overconfident, which is, like, one of the biggest kind of blessings and curses that we have. But at the same time, there's like participating in prediction markets is definitely the sort of thing where, like, I think people's impression is that it's not super easy to win money, and it's and the amount of money at stake is not that large yet, and they're not really convenient yet. So just issues that could potentially resolve themselves as the system is just kind of grow on their own. And so we'll have to wait and see. I mean, I'm really excited for Augur V2 coming out, so we'll see.
Yeah, so I recall that one of the things that Robin Hanson said was that, you know, one of the uses of a prediction market might be that in an organization, you can use them to identify the best predictors in the organization. But it turns out that maybe when you realize who those people are or what they're predicting, you don't actually want those predictions in the end. Like maybe they're contrary to whatever your entrenched interests are or something like this. Do you also see this as a problem in these markets or not so much?
And I think his points about like organizations wanting like, or people in elites inside of organizations kind of preferring mechanisms that feel good to them over mechanisms that are correct or kind of optimal, at least sometimes. I think there's definitely some value to it. But then there's also prediction markets that have nothing to do with organizations, right? Even like prediction markets on who's going to be the next president or like which way is some world event going to go or whatever. Like there's a lot of those, and even those
right. It's like a popular market.
Yeah. Like, I mean, even those have less volume than a lot of people have been expecting. So like there's another part of the puzzle there too.
Let's see.
So a question from Jorge Oliveros. Apologies if I've mispronounced this. How do you think about the ability of governments to formally restrict or even technically restrict peer-to-peer internet overlays, which power networks like Bitcoin and Ethereum, laws governing the physical medium at the level of ISPs, and technical solutions like packet filtering are a viable way to disrupt these networks, it seems. And just more generally, there's this problem of you know, as these decentralized mechanisms kind of embed themselves in the real world and interface with the rest of the social system, there's many ways that they can end up being governed. So how do you think about that whole part of the problem?
Yeah, I think I'm not expecting that decentralized protocols are going to come under kind of full-on attack for two reasons. And one of the reasons is that taking them down actually isn't all that easy, right? And you know, if you start doing packet filtering, then you can just switch to everyone running a node from inside of VPN. Then everyone might start to run a node from inside of Tor, and there's this entire industry of like VPNs that are designed toward Chinese users. And if more countries start doing that, then that just increases the demand, and those tools are only going to get more powerful. So, and the second thing is that like there's this like. So rationalists refer to this as trivial inconveniences. This is basically the idea that in order to stop people, like most people, from doing something, you don't actually have to try that hard to ban it. You just have to make it inconvenient, right? And so, like, in order to make cryptocurrency much less viable than it is today, you don't have to go all the way to making it impossible to like send Bitcoin and Ethereum blocks and transactions. You just have to I mean, ban all the exchanges and strictly enforce the ban, and you're like more than 90% of the way there, right? So there's like this entire array of strategies that's less extreme and much more politically palatable than like attacking the internet itself. And so I think if the political tide turns against the crypto networks, they'll just like do those things first.
But and then even on, like, they don't have to even go against the whole network, like trying to get rid of the thing. They just have to, like, even easier is to say, get the exchanges to cooperate with the state on, censoring particular users or turning over data, that kind of thing. Like, I think this kind of stuff already happens. And so it's this interesting way where, despite being nominally decentralized, it ends up still embedded in the social system in a centralized way.
Yep.
Speaking of that, Matt has an interesting question here. What are some of the other bureaucratic institutions in state and society that could be next disrupted by smart contracts and blockchain? So, we're quite comfortable with the idea of blockchain in money and finance, but what about law and justice or diplomacy, for example? Right.
And so I mentioned decentralized arbitration already, right? And I think kind of arbitration as an API and as this kind of decentralized thing is something that could be potentially very powerful if people learn kind of all of the ways that they can build on top of it. Also, decentralized kind of account management could be fairly significant. So this is this kind of function that's currently being taken on by basically Google and Facebook and Twitter, kind of managing your root account that you basically use. Like, it's originally an email or a social service, but ultimately you use the thing to sign into your other things. And so it's basically kind of the root of your online life in some sense. And that's something that, like, you might think centralized providers are good at doing, but actually they're really not good at doing it. And so I could see partially decentralized alternatives kind of being incubated in the crypto space and then kind of starting to branch out from there. Things to do with reputation and kind of identity and credit, potentially.
Could you elaborate a bit on that?
For a lot of this stuff.
Yeah, so even things like just using a cryptographic proof to say that, like, I have been verified by this service as having these particular properties, and I'm a unique individual, and so, like, you should give me these privileges inside of your system. Like, things that people just use, like, different kinds of centralized identity providers for right now that could easily be kind of replaced with a more fluid ecosystem where you as a user kind of maintain more control of the process, and you're kind of providing proofs that you interacted with these other systems.
Well, it's interesting because I just want to jump on that a little bit, because it seems like one of the powerful aspects of identity is when it becomes centralized. So I'm thinking, for example, of the way that Facebook has become kind of like a passport now on the internet, right? There's lots of accounts you make to just log in with your Facebook. I know Estonia has a system where you kind of have a digital ID as well. And it seems like that transferability between different institutions and things you have to, like, log in on essentially is a strength. So it's interesting that you are thinking of that, though, as a decentralization.
Yeah, and I think basically you could see a change where entities like Facebook basically kind of switch roles from being the controller to being an attester. And so they provide attestations, but the kind of center of the progress or of the process is a kind of cryptographic thing that's running locally on your computer.
I see. Wolf, did you want to grab the next?
Yeah, so we have a question from Jason Crawford asking, what's the opportunity for decentralized social networks to finally take off? I mean, we've seen many decentralized social networks or attempts at them over the years. I've been watching the space for like 10 years. None of them ever quite seem to get that network effect or never quite seem to take off. So what do you think will actually allow decentralized social networking to happen?
Yeah, so I think the challenge that decentralized social networks have is basically, like, how do you do content curation and content filtering? Like, and so this is like another one of the ways I think in which like the cypherpunk movement, like I think is, or at least my cypherpunk movement has kind of changed over the last decade. Like when you have relatively little information, the thing you focus on is just free speech and making sure everyone who wants to say things can say things. But when you have like a lot of people talking and a lot of information, and where the free speech itself seems relatively secure, the challenge moves to, well, how do we create mechanisms to to kind of promote things and like basically help people choose what they end up being able to see, and that's and often that's the layer that's kind of at the source of controversy right now, right? Like,
yeah,
if even just like a random example, the Tom Cotton's op-ed that got into the New York Times a couple of days ago, like no one's upset that he was able to write the thing. They were upset that the New York Times signal boosted it, right? So like all the controversies recently are kind of about the signal boosting aspect. And if you have a decentralized social network, then you have to have some form of signal boosting thing of some kind. And the thing that excites me personally is just the idea that we could have a lot of these different networks, and we could have just a lot of experimentation and different techniques for performing this function. And we can see kind of which ones work well, right? Like you could see kind of community-driven approaches where like you would have smaller communities and like people could see things like even just Reddit's community points thing that they announced about a month ago, right? Where basically you can see kind of not just the raw number of upvotes, but also kind of the total number of points associated with a community. So the total kind of level of community membership of people that upvoted some particular post. And you could imagine a lot of other different kinds of mechanisms. So just like get people to try hundreds of different things and see what ends up working. And if something does end up working, then great, right? But I think that like this kind of curation and kind of sorting and filtering challenge is basically the core.
Yeah, the network effect does seem to be the key question there, right? Because if you just try to branch off Twitter and make a new Twitter, you're probably not going to get very many people. And so, you need to invent something like TikTok, essentially, like invent an actually different platform for this to work really well.
Right.
Go ahead if you had any.
I was just going to say, and the other thing, like, and this is like one of the decentralized social media paths that some people are following, is basically trying to kind of separate the content publishing layer from the content viewing layer. And so the theory would be that you could write a post, and when you write a post, the post is just a post and it's automatically just out there. And then, you basically, in some sense, you're kind of simultaneously publishing to every platform. And the layer of like choosing what people get to see is the thing that people basically get to compete on, right? And so that way, like if that kind of ecosystem is actually possible, then you actually end up sharing a lot of network effect across the different services.
Right. I'm going to jump to a question from Samo here. You're kind of moving into various kinds of political thinking. Is there a statesman in recent history that you particularly admire or take as a strong example for the kinds of changes you'd like to see happen?
I mean, can I say Audrey? I like Audrey.
Sure. I mean, yeah, a current, maybe, Audrey Tang's story is quite interesting, having been a programmer and then gone into the highest levels, of the Taiwanese government. We chatted a bit when the show started about how hard or easy it is for people with these kinds of ideas to actually enter the institutions of government. Do you think that Audrey is someone people should look at as an example of actually entering the halls of power, so to speak?
Actually, yes. I'm not sure if she still calls herself this, but I remember a few years ago she called herself a conservative anarchist. In this, in the sense of that, she likes decentralization, but she's also in favor of a slow and gradual approach and a cooperative approach. So basically, despite her wanting to decentralize things more, she was able to get into and have a very significant influence in like shaping, like, for example, e-government in Taiwan for the better. So I think like that kind of approach of like basically being like wanting to reform the system and like being a revolutionary and valuing those things while at the same time kind of successfully navigating a cooperative approach with like basically what already exists, I think is a successful story that a lot of people could emulate.
Yeah, I mean, you know, insofar as you're doing political thinking, are you someone who looks a lot at history when it comes to these issues, or are you very present and future focused?
Yeah. I've definitely done my fair share of just looking at history in general. And do I look at history when I think about, specifically think about political challenges? Somewhat less so. And I guess one of the challenges is that the kind of information that's kind of been tends to be available about kind of history so far, at least if you take a surface view, is information that I think is actually not very useful to like big political questions. Like if you want to understand big political questions, you would have to understand like really detailed things about like within a particular country, like what did like particular disputes between businesses and government look like what did urban planning look like in, you know, like 1860, like what like a lot of very fine-grained things. And history of those kinds of things does exist, but at the same time, it's not the kind of like history that people tends to have a lot of access to easily. Now, and maybe I couldn't, I kind of should and will end up doing like much more explicit attempts at like looking into like history of very specific kind of professions or very specific aspects of society as they existed a long time ago. And I mean, there definitely are kind of specific elements of this. So like, for example, and David Friedman has this book, Milton Friedman's son, and also kind of himself fairly famous within the anarcho-capitalist community, has this book, like Legal Systems Very Different from Ours, where he explores a lot of legal systems that existed in like Iceland and other places. And he has in his book that very famous example from Greece where they, the way that they encourage people to basically honestly report how much money they have is they basically say, if you get declared to be the wealthiest, but you think someone else is wealthier than you but is hiding their money, then you can basically offer to swap all your assets with them. And if they refuse, then that shows that they're wealthier than you, and so they've been underreporting. And so it's this really
and the key thing here is I forget the number, but the top 100 wealthiest citizens, I think it was, had to basically pay for the state. They were the tax base. So if you're number like 100 and there's this guy 101, maybe you want to like roll the dice that actually he's richer than you, and that's kind of the problem it's trying to solve.
Like I definitely think about things like that, and I find things like that very interesting, and I guess like I would love to see more of that kind of history even being accessible. I mean, it is possible. I'm just looking in the wrong places as well. But
and that's more like the case study method rather than these like broad conceptual narratives and so on.
Right, and I guess and the challenge with the broad conceptual narratives is that just even looking at present society and just knowing the disparity between the broad conceptual narratives that are kind of very loud in public and like the very specific things that are happening, I just know that you can't get that much information out of the broad and conceptual narratives.
Yeah, totally. All right, I think this is a good place to cut it off. We're unfortunately out of time. So thank you so much, Vitalik, for joining us. This is a very interesting discussion. I hope we can continue the conversation sometime in the future.
Yeah, we should. It was good to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, and thanks to the audience, of course, for great questions. Special thanks to all of our Palladium members. To become a member and get invited to upcoming salons, please visit us at palladiummag.com/subscribe. And remember to subscribe to Palladium Magazine on YouTube and follow us on Twitter at Palladium Mag. You can follow Vitalik on Twitter at Vitalik Buterin. So thanks, everyone. We'll see you next time.
Thanks, everybody. It was great.